Thank you for listening to this Podcast One production, available on Apple Podcasts and Podcast One.
Pluto TV, by the way, is the leading free streaming television service. You watch over 100 TV channels and thousands of movies on demand, all for free. No credit card needed, no sign up. Pluto TV is the easy and completely legal way to watch your favorite TV shows and your hit movies. So what are you waiting for? Never pay for TV again. Pluto TV is free on all of your favorite devices. Download Pluto TV today.
Your life, your country. You're listening to the Laura Ingraham Podcast.
It just seems like yesterday when we were reading all these high-minded pieces in The Economist and the Daily Telegraph about, it's the end of economic nationalism and Trump-style populism is over. It's not working. Brexit is not working. It's not going to happen. Everybody is going to see the glories of globalism, and this was just a risky gambit, this Trump Brexit thing in 2016, and now we're going to see the wonders of more of an open borders approach to living and multiculturalism, and it was all going to be great. Well, where did that end up? Well, we're kind of back where we started here. Now, this is not a sign, I don't think, of necessarily the elites are not going to give up. They're the elites. They're not going to give up and say, okay, Trump was right and Nigel Farage was right with Brexit. I mean, of course they're not going to. This is being a fight to the finish here. We got the big EU referendum, which is a monster of a referendum. So important. Elections, I should say. So you're electing members of the European Parliament from every member nation. And the thought is, well, now this is a chance for Europeans to push back the rise of nationalism. It really put it back on its heels. But what happened? Well, what happened is Theresa May is allowing, 1 million plus refugees into Europe, all the problems that caused, countries from Spain to Sweden, to, of course, in France and Germany itself. That was a huge mistake. That, I think, almost more than anything else, has resulted in a rise of more populist nationalists, not nationalists in the negative sense, but nationalists in a good sense for the most part, of people's desire to protect what so many bled and died for over the years, which is a distinct country with a distinct culture, still welcoming immigrants, but with the understanding that you have to want to be part of our country, our history with all of its warts and triumphs. And whether we're talking about Sweden or Poland or this re-entry of Nigel Farage, the former UKIP, UK Independence Party leader who pushed the first Brexit vote successfully, he comes back into the political arena because what happened? Theresa May's Conservative Party bombed on the Brexit. They bombed. They really never wanted Brexit. They never really had the juice to get it through. She said she was pro-Brexit. She really wasn't. And she's on her way out. She's going to be gone probably in the next week. So this referendum, it is a referendum on, in many ways, the EU itself, happening this week. And I think once again we find that despite the snake oil that we've been sold on globalization and globalism and working with China and all this, it never really panned out. People want a sense of safety, of security, and a belief that if you work hard and play by the rules, you can make a decent living. And in places like France and in the UK, we saw a crushing effect on the middle class of the policies of globalization. And so all the left is left with, as wages stagnated, as the middle class was crushed, open borders resulted in a upheaval culturally in these countries. Upheaval. It wasn't just a common market. That's different, having a common currency, a common market with trade. That's somewhat different. But when it comes to open borders, that's where you get the problem. So in other words, a Romanian can come and live in Britain, don't need any visa, don't need any special. Bulgarian everyone can live together. No, it's all going to be wonderful. Well, until it isn't. So all the left is left with is demonization, just like happens here in the United States. So in other words, President Emmanuel Macron, going into these EU elections, has to demean and try to destroy people from the other more nationalist movements. So they're racist, they're xenophobes, they're bad people. They want to rip France apart. They're dividers. Why don't you debate why this is working? But they don't really want to debate, which is why Nigel Farage, again, who registered more people in the Brexit Party than the labor movement did in the lead up to the EU elections. This is why Nigel Farage has been so popular, because he always looks at them and says, why are you afraid of debating? Let's debate what's happened to the UK post-EU. Let's debate it. And when he did debate leading up to the Brexit vote, he wiped the floor. I watched these debates. They were so much fun. When he was debating like Jeremy Corbyn, I was, oh my gosh, it was hilarious. So he's debating all these different leaders. I think Corbyn was the one that I believe, unless I'm getting it mixed up. We played it on radio. We played the entire, series of debates, snippets, the best parts. It was something you couldn't turn away from. It was that good. Well, they realized debates were not good for them. They lose debates. Not good. So they don't debate. They demonize. Same thing happening in the United States. Trump is saying we must act as a check on China now because our industries are affected, our people are affected, our jobs are affected, our national security is affected if all the steel is made in China. What happens if all the steel plants go out of business in the United States? And it's all made in China. Do we really think that's good for our national security? For ships, for tanks, for everything we need, for everything else? Now we're seeing what happens when China dominates rare earth materials, which are necessary in every cell phone and every computer. They dominate that market now. Do you think that was smart that we allowed that to happen? Now, as a matter of national security, it's not smart. As a matter of economic policy, it wasn't smart. But now they're threatening us on rare earth materials because they're up against the wall with these Trump tariffs. But Trump has the actual guts to say, if it's short-term blips in the market and short-term pain, it's necessary, and we can withstand it in a $20 trillion economy. We can withstand this temporary trade pain much more so than China can, which is desperate for our markets. So now is the time. I mean, it's now or never. Now is the time to get these concessions from China, and they're going to puff, and they're going to claim that they're going to fight to the finish, and it's going to be all this militaristic language from China. It's ridiculous. And meanwhile, the U.S. is, as all this is happening, again, nationalism and Hungary and Czech Republic and Poland, the popularity of the Brexit Party. We see the Yellow Vest movement in France, which is somewhat different, but there's some common themes there. We have the Swedish anti-immigration parties, which are really more pro-Swedish parties, but there's some movement in Sweden, a lot of movement in Sweden, against the socialist open borders mentality. That's just a horrifically unpopular point of view now in Sweden, given the rise in crime, given the rise in number of rapes, many of them committed by refugees. This is not made up stuff. This is happening. My friends in Sweden send me the translated articles, and they're horrified by what's happened. So you have a common sense, more pragmatic nationalism, still welcoming into immigrants who want to be part of the culture of these countries, versus the head in the sand globalism, open borders, open markets that animated the financial world and the elite circles in the academy and politics for decades now. So this is a battle. See, China is all about nationalism. They are whipping up nationalist sentiment in China. The problem is we still got 300 million people living in poverty in China. or more, maybe a little bit more than that. You got 1.3 billion people, 300 million living in poverty. They don't have the juice that we have. We have the economy and the might and the strength to preserve our culture, our people, our sense of identity. And don't let anyone tell you that that's bad. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. You're not going to get people to fight and die for a concept of global community. The only way people will volunteer to serve this country's military if they're protecting something, the principles of America, our freedom, our independence, our culture. And that's why it's so important not to give it all away. Joining us now, I'm delighted he's with us, Yoram Hazony. He's an Israeli philosopher, Bible scholar, political theorist, author of the great book, The Virtue of Nationalism. He joins us now. And Yoram, good to have you with us. Nigel Farage was on this podcast in March, and he was anticipating what was to come, given the foot dragging on Brexit.
If we're still members, which I predict right now we will be, on May the 23rd, we will then have to fight elections to the European Parliament across the entire United Kingdom,
God.
Right?
Yes.
And that's the moment. That's the moment at which I re-enter the political fray.
Yes.
If we have to fight those European elections, I will lead, and I've just formed a new party. It's called the Brexit Party. Great. And I will fight back against the establishment on May the 23rd. And all I can tell you is watch this space, because the gap between what the people want and the politicians want is huge. And I tell you what, Brexit only happened because I took them on last time. If I take them on again, I make you a promise. Next time from me, it's no more Mr. Nice Guy.
Yoram, I knew Nigel was going to get back in this, and they ridicule him, and they throw milkshakes at him, and they demean him, and caricatures, and the cartoonists, and so forth. But it's pretty impressive what Farage was able to do after being demeaned by pretty much every member of the elite circles in the UK, the EU, caricatured. They threw stuff at him, milkshakes. But man, there's still some fight in the UK for real independence.
You can't suppress a people that wants to be independent, and when we need to remember that that Americans and really the entire Western world inherited this love of political independence from the English, from the British. And it's great to see that there's still some fight. The May government, which has been in power for the last 3 years and has failed to deliver Brexit, has failed to deliver political independence for the UK, even though the public voted for it. That's got to be one of the weakest and most humiliating governments that I think we've ever seen at the head of a democratic nation, and so the response of the British public to say enough, we can't go on this way. We need our independence. I think it's something breathtaking to see, and it's inspiring.
You're seeing this rise of, and I know people hear nationalism and Germany, and they think, oh, we're going back to socialism and National Socialist Party, and that's not what we're talking about. But you do see a rise of concern. Some of it's anti-immigrant, and the refugees ushered in by Angela Merkel really fundamentally changed German society and other countries, of course, across Europe. And the parties ultimately reacted against that. I mean, that one move on her part to push for the opening of the doors of Europe to mostly Muslim refugees, that, I think, more than almost anything else, really brought this whole issue to a head. Do you agree on that?
I do agree. I think up until that moment in 2015, when Merkel unilaterally, single-handedly, decided that she was going to, in 1 year, accept 2 or 3% of the German population of Muslim immigrants from the Middle East. That decision kind of ripped the mask off of this liberal internationalism. Up until that point, every time you said, "Look, you people, you're like John Lennon, like you don't believe in borders. You don't believe in national cohesion. You don't believe in the independence of unique nations. So you would say that, and people would say, "Oh, come on, you're exaggerating." But from the moment that Merkel did that, and she let in 1.5 million refugees from the Middle East into Germany, the moment she did that, it kind of ripped the mask off, and people suddenly saw, my God, these people they're not pragmatists. They're dogmatic idealists. Like, they really just don't believe in borders. They really don't believe in nations. And that, more than anything else, I think really has, as you say, energized politicians and publics throughout the democratic world who say we don't want John Lennon. We want our country.
Well, you think about what's happened across the globe. We had this stunning victory of the Conservatives in Australia. No one predicted it, much like what happened with Trump, but even probably more mind-blowing. In Australia, you just had these huge win in India of a Hindu nationalist party. Obviously, we've been following, because I'm half Polish, so we're following what's happening in Poland and in the Czech Republic and in Hungary. And every country is different. Every country has a different ebb and flow. But the one thing that unites all these different movements is the elites vilify them. No matter what they do, no matter how they've come to power, the elites will vilify them as racist, xenophobic, nativist, et cetera, at the exact same thing that they do to Donald Trump and to Netanyahu, and to, they do. It's the same. It's different, but it's the same.
It is the same. What I think it's important to understand, we don't have to approve of the national government of any of these particular countries. Each of those countries, it has its own culture and its own traditions. They're going to do things their way, and sometimes we won't like it. But that's what freedom is about. Freedom is about the fact that each nation decides its own course. And you're absolutely right that what is common to all of these cases that are so different, what's common to them is an international ruling class of people who want us to believe that there are no national differences, that there is no such thing as national culture. You don't need to know national heritage, because we've got a single market worldview, economy, and we've got a universal human rights theory for individual liberties, and that's it. We don't need anything else. And that means there's no such thing as an American heritage, an American tradition that's special to Americans. It doesn't matter. Germans could rule America as well as Americans, according to that crazy worldview. And look at how angry, how bitter and really just violently aggressive these elites become the moment it turns out that there's a Democratic majority in their country that doesn't want to be swallowed up by liberal internationalism.
Yeah, I think that when you look at what Farage was saying at this debate against Vince Cable, as a liberal Dem leader, he's the only one who would agree to debate Farage. This kind of captures the moment. Let's listen.
There is a problem in this country, and it's this, that civilized democracy only works if you have the loser's consent. So we have an election, and the loser says, look, I don't like the result, but I accept it because we're a free and fair country. What has happened here is we've had the greatest democratic exercise in the history of the nation. And we've got senior figures, I mean, even two former prime ministers, Vince himself, people who refuse to accept the result of that referendum. They've given the impression by saying that those that voted for Brexit didn't understand what they were voting for. And we're thick, we're stupid, we're ignorant, we're racist. These are all the things that have been said. And it's given people a sense that those who voted Remain feel morally superior to those who voted Leave. And I think one of the reasons we've got such appalling behaviour on our streets, this new militant Remainer type, and goodness me, their behaviour, I hope Vince will condemn some of it, because the behaviour out there right across the country is vile, is because they genuinely think, because they're superior to the Leavers, they can do whatever they like.
Your reaction, he's so on point.
That's exactly right. I mean, we've seen that in the United States. Look, Democrats don't have to like the views of Republicans, and Republicans don't have to like the views of Democrats. But Farage is right that the only way to hold the democracy together is if each side sees that the other is legitimate. That means if you lose the election, then you let the other side govern. And we saw that, our entire lives. We got to see in America and other democratic countries that kind of orderly change of power from one party to another. But it's completely different now. After Brexit and after Trump, the left no longer accepts the legitimacy of the right. You can't be a legitimate conservative anymore in the eyes of lots and lots of intellectuals and public figures. The moment that you're a conservative, they say, oh, well, actually, you're a racist, you're an authoritarian, or you're leading to racism, you're leading to authoritarianism. This has got to change because you can't hold the country together this way. You have to allow two sides of the argument.
Well, and I think you see this in their attacks on individuals at every level, whether in the media, conservative media figures. I've been subjected to this, and it is just the way it is now. I mean, they don't want to beat you in a debate so much as they want to banish you from the public square forever as illegitimate. And the same thing they did with Trump. So Fox, Trump, the kid who is 10, who's starting a lemonade stand, proceeds going to the border wall. The professor who says no to the victim studies mentality on campus, where people are segmented into various victims groups and taught to despise the American tradition. A professor even raises that, then good luck ever getting tenure. So that's the way they're doing it. There's no debate. They're not winning a debate, but they are winning in some respect the demonization game, because a lot of people self-censor themselves now, Yoram. They self-censor. They're afraid to speak out. And so when Trump and Farage come along, it's like a breath of fresh air. I'm like, someone's finally speaking for me, because I'm biting my tongue in the workplace. I'm biting my tongue in the military. I'm biting my tongue in elementary school and high school and college. And so these guys come along and say, this doesn't have to be this way. This is ridiculous.
Yeah, it is ridiculous. But it's worse than, it's not just ridiculous, because it's the beginning of what was once known as the Reign of Terror.
Yeah.
And, of course, the actual Reign of Terror in the French Revolution also involved executing people. We're not at that stage, obviously. People are just being executed in the sense that if you say the wrong word, then you lose your job, you lose your career. But that is a kind of terror. And people on both sides should not want to live like that. 30 years ago in the United States, you could pretty much say what you wanted. People wouldn't like it. They might call you names, but you wouldn't lose your job and your career because you said the wrong word. And we should understand we're losing free speech. We're losing free speech because we're losing the idea of a two-party system where both sides are legitimate. And that doesn't end well historically. Historically, once you get on that road where you're saying, no, you're not legitimate, you're not allowed to speak.
You're not human almost.
Once you get on that road, you are on the road to dictatorship. And all decent people on both sides need to see that's where we're going and to find a way to get off this train.
And the really rich thing, Yoram, is that they'll say that Trump is the dictator, or Farage is cozying up with dictators, or this is their game. So it's like the finger's always pointed back at you, as the Buddha said. You're accusing them of that's what you're leading to.
It takes both sides to get off of this. If you don't have majorities, strong majorities, both on the left and on the right, who want mutual legitimacy. They want both parties to be legitimate. If you don't have that, you don't want democracy.
Well, Yoram Hazany, your book was phenomenal, The Virtue of Nationalism. And I think you started off this interview by saying, free people are going to keep fighting for their freedom. You can't keep people down if they want their freedom. And I think
that's right.
I think that really does. So it's going to be ugly. We got into this place over decades and decades, of just in the last 50 years, really. And these theories began in the academy. They were ultimately mainstreamed by the popular culture. They were adopted by the Democrats and liberals. and now they're being mainstreamed in public schools and further in the social media. And so that's how it all happened. But these crazy ideas all started in the academy. All, for the most part. True. I mean, these were all academic theories that turned into, let's try this. And
that's true, and it's a super important point. Look at what's happening on the university campus, and what you see is an image of what the country is going to be like in 30 years. All right, so if you look at the university and you say, this is crazy, only Marxist and liberal views are allowed, no conservative views are allowed to be spoken. If that's what you're seeing, just wait until those kids grow up. Like, wait till they take power. In 30 years, America, Britain, each country is going to look like what its universities look like today. So if we want to change direction, then we've got to find a way of changing the universities. That means starting new universities. That means maybe cutting off the extensive government support for existing universities. I mean,
the problem, though, here's the problem, though, Yoram, with that, is that when you have a $30 billion endowment, or whatever Harvard's is today, or maybe even more, you're insulated from accountability from the alumni and the students. That's the problem. They're mini governments, these big universities. They're governments unto themselves. And they keep raising tuition rates because we keep making it easier for people to go to college because we think that's the right thing. Everyone should go to a 4-year institution. And so they've been able to continue to raise tuition.
I think that's true, but I also think I know quite a few professors, and they really care about research grants. And at the moment, what's happening is, look, there are good people in the universities. There are decent people, but like you say, they keep their heads down.
Yeah.
And what that means, they're afraid to speak out. I mean, they're liberals, but they're afraid to say, I think this department has 30 professors. Why don't we hire a conservative or two to give an alternative view? They're afraid to say that. Mm-hmm. If there's enough pressure on the research funding, then some of those people will start, they'll start changing their tune. I mean, you're right about Harvard's endowment, but most universities don't have an endowment like Harvard's. And even Harvard really cares about all those research grants. And how about all that student aid? I mean, their students are able to go to Harvard because of student aid. That's a huge amount of money. I think Harvard even will care about it.
Yoram, thank you so much for joining us. The book, The Virtue of Nationalism, is our featured selection on lauraingraham.com and Facebook, so make sure to read it. It's important now as we go into the 2020 election cycle because you're going to hear a lot of lies about what Trump believes, what Trump wants. He's a dictator. And you need the ammo to be able to fight back in these debates, so check that book out. And I want to tell you about your great options in skincare, especially as we head into these hot summer months. And the Genucel jawline treatment, which you've been hearing me talk about, I know people are worried, I don't have any more money to spend on this. Well, here's the good thing. It's free, and I mean free when you order the classic that you should already have in your makeup kit or your DOP kit, which is the Genucel for under-eye bags and puffiness. And so the Genucel you need anyway, you should have one where you travel and one at home. So get one of those, then you'll get the jawline treatment absolutely free, and you'll be good to go. And that skin is very susceptible to aging and wrinkling around your jawline. It really shows your age. So try to do what you can to have a better approach to your own skincare. And different parts of your face especially requires different treatment. It's not all for one and all your skin on your face. You need different treatment. And our friends at Chamonix understand this better than anyone. It has the MDL technology. None of those harsh treatments that people use, the acid peels, all the stuff people do to their faces. You don't need to do any of that. Just go to Genucel.com. That's Genucel.com. Or text EYES1 to 77453. And for a limited time, Chamonix will include a second surprise luxury gift for free. Again, EYES1 to 77453. Or just visit Genucel.com. That's Genucel.com. And as we focus on what works in the United States, what actually is working, a more prudent foreign policy, a less visionary approach, or I think, a fantasy-based approach that America can remake the world in its image. Certainly not what Reagan believed. Reagan believed in preserving America through peace through strength and staring down the Soviet Union by refusing to do all this high-tech trade with them, machinery, manufacturing, and that helped over time drive the Soviet Union to its knees. We did not engage with the Soviet Union. So my question is, why are we doing all this engagement with China? Why did we ever do all this engagement with Red China? Because a lot of people wanted to make a lot of money there. That's why. And a lot of people were wrong. Alan Greenspan, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, the folks over at The Economist, the Financial Times, the list goes on and on. All these economists who predicted this nirvana in China of freedom would be bursting out all over if they had a chance to make our refrigerators. Joining us now is Pat Buchanan, conservative commentator, columnist, author extraordinaire. He joins us now. Pat, how are you, my friend?
Doing fine. How are you?
I'm good, but it looks like we're going to send 10,000 troops and a mission creep over in the Gulf because of these Iranian threats. Where are we on that, Pat?
I think the President of the United States, I don't think, wants a war with Iran. I don't think the Iranians want a war with the United States. They would be horribly damaged. All of their military assets would be destroyed in a major war. But what concerns me is that there are people here and people in the Middle East who do want a war, who do want a conflict, and who believe that's the only way to effect regime change in Iran. And many of the same voices that we heard when we were told that if we simply went up to Baghdad and knocked over Saddam Hussein, then the natural democratic desires of the Iraqi people would be expressed, and we would have a new democracy and a pro-Western nation there. And none of it worked out because people don't understand the reality of these places.
Well, I think, again, the hot economy that we have, the rising consumer confidence, the generally sunny outlook from businesses, mid-sized, small, and large, except for a few soybean interests, I don't see why we would want to mess that up by getting involved in some other military conflict in the Middle East. That's like the surefire way for Trump to lose the election in 2020.
Well, it is. It's even worse, I think, for the United States because it would postpone forever, almost forever, us getting out of that region of the world into which we should never have plunged ourselves. Under George W. Bush, when we made that strategic mistake of invading Iraq, occupying Iraq, and trying to remake Iraq, and we couldn't do it. And what we did is we destabilized pretty much the entire region with our attack in Iraq and our attempts to turn Afghanistan into a pro-Western nation, and the attack in Libya, and getting involved and trying to dump over Assad in Syria, and involving ourselves in that war in Yemen, which has turned into a human rights disaster. I mean, Laura, go back to the beginning of this century, and I understand after 9/11 you've got to take down the Taliban if they won't get rid of Al-Qaeda. But having done that, your job was pretty much done there. And what did we think we could accomplish by plunging in there? I mean, look at all the suffering and death, and it's something like, I think by Trump's count and others' count, $6 trillion in losses, and $6 trillion sunk for what? And while we're all distracted fighting all these wars, democratizing the Middle East, I mean, China grew into a great and mighty power and great rival of the United States, and I think a great antagonist of this country.
Well, and look at what we've seen happen to our wealth, our military degraded, our men and women who've sacrificed, paid the ultimate price. And we find that the trigger effect throughout the Middle East was devastating. I mean, you had the Syrian crisis, you had the refugee crisis, you had Mubarak out. Of course, what happened in Libya, Benghazi, but the entire Libyan government, radicalism busting out all over. I mean, again, the law of unintended consequences and wide-ranging effects.
Let me say, I'm no fan of the Ayatollah's regime at all, and I think they detest the United States. They bear a grudge against the United States. Yeah. But Iran is not the one that destabilized the Middle East. Two things destabilized it in this century. The first was the Arab Spring, where many of these old-line dictators and generals and others who had been in power a long time were overthrown by the masses in the streets. And the second destabilizer was the massive military intervention of the United States and its allies trying to remake these governments, these regimes, in our own image when the soil was not fertile for democratic, liberal democracy. They had never known this. And so when you knocked over their present government, they would create new ones which reflected their beliefs and not ours.
Well, and I think, again, we look back to 9/11 and that horrible day and the desire for retribution, and you're right, we had to smash back at the Taliban. But, oh my gosh, I mean, can you imagine if at the time you'd say, okay, we're going to do this, then we're going to go into Iraq, and then we're going to lose, like, ultimately, how many people did we lose in Iraq? 5,000? Something like that?
5,000 and 2,000 in Afghanistan,
yeah.
And then 40,000 wounded, and I don't know how many others have come.
Marriages destroyed,
various
suicides.
Problems and social damage and all the rest of it, right.
PTSD.
But, let me ask you this, Laura. Suppose we had to do it over again, and this were now 2002, and I will say that we launched the American Conservative magazine to try to stop the rush to war that the neocons were pushing, Bush and Cheney and all the rest. But imagine if we had not invaded Iraq. We had not tried to rebuild Afghanistan, but just did the job, got rid of the Taliban, got rid of al-Qaeda. We had not attacked in Libya. We had not gotten involved with the Saudis in Yemen. If we had not tried to overthrow the government by aiding rebels in Syria. If we hadn't done any of these things, would we be so horribly worse off than we are today? Which one of them is a success?
Oh, I completely agree. I mean, we have to remember, Pat, that the reason, I think one of the main reasons that Obama won in 2008, not just because he was a historic first, but because he was against the Iraq War. And,
sure, he was the one fellow that stood up against it before the war began in the Democratic Party. I mean, there were people standing up against that war by George W. Bush, but unfortunately they didn't succeed. But now we've got some of the same folks who think that we're going to settle the problem if we can change the regime in Iran. And I don't know how you do that absent an invasion and going up to Tehran and replacing the government, which would take, I saw recently, maybe 1 million troops to do. And we're not going to do that. Iran is 3 times the size of Iraq, almost 3 times the population, a much stronger army, and, much better positioned strategically. And so I don't know why we would do it. What benefit are we going to get out of this? How does Iran threaten the United States of America right now?
Yeah, well, again, I think the claim is a rising Iran, Shia excesses. We're worried about that. Then why we were so quick to knock off Saddam Hussein? It was the most. I mean, Mr. Chief
we fought
rival.
The Iranians for 8 years, and we knocked him over. And the Iranians walked in and said, "Let's be friends with the majority Shia here."
Yeah. Well, when I was in Iraq in 2006, it was when things were getting really bad, and I remember interviewing one of our top military leaders, and I can't remember his name. I'm focusing on his face, and I can't remember his name. The commanding general in Iraq at the time, and he said, "I said, well, why is it that all these IEDs I'm hearing they're being made in Iran? Like all these IEDs, they have triggers and mechanisms that look Iranian made." And they didn't like that when I asked that question. And it was because Iran was benefiting from the destabilization of Iraq, and they wanted to have their foothold in there. I mean, period.
Sure, Saddam Hussein he fought it was a war of aggression on Saddam's part, but he launched the war against Iran soon after the Iranian the Ayatollah's crowd overthrew the Shah's people and imposed a new regime. He launched that war. It lasted something like 8 years, and the Iranian casualties were enormous. And for whatever you can say about Saddam, who was a real devil as a human being and an aggressor, I mean, he was a checkpoint against the Iranians. And once Saddam went down, who represented the Sunnis up there in Anbar and the Sunni minority, which controlled the country, in the democracy, the Shia, the more numerous Shia, came to power, and their cousins are in Tehran.
No, it's absolutely horrible. Meanwhile, Pat, we have to. No, it's like
strategic brilliance.
Yeah, and we had all the Muqtada al-Sadr. We had all this.
Now they're all over the parliament.
Yeah, now they're like, well, we're so we've driven 1 million Christians out of Iraq. No big deal. It's only their ancestral homeland. They lived in peace and security under the vicious Saddam. I mean, that was the bizarre thing. Remember, he had that Tariq Aziz was his main his right hand man. Yeah, right hand man.
He was a Christian, yeah. And that's it. I thought we should have dealt with him because they didn't. Saddam Hussein didn't want a war. Toward the end, he was asked, almost ready to invite in the CIA. Come in and see for yourselves. We don't have these weapons of mass destruction you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And we're told that they got them all right. They've been meeting with Al Qaeda in Prague, and they got one of these little Piper Cub type planes, which is going to drop all this anthrax on America's East Coast and all this other nonsense. And Colin Powell has a great reputation, but it's been damaged in history by what he had to testify to up at the United Nations. And I got to think he's somewhat ashamed of the role he played in it.
No, it was General Casey. I just remembered it. It was General George Casey. That's who I was talking to at the time. It was a great guy, but they were dealt in. But then it was like the surge. How many times do we hear about the surge, Pat? Oh, the surge! It's successful. We got, and then we're working with the tribal elders. I'm seeing these 21-year-old kids, 22-year-old kids, second lieutenant, just graduated from West Point, and they're in there trying to negotiate with these elders outside of Balad, and I'm thinking, this is just crazy. We don't know. I mean, these are great great kids, but this is not what our military is equipped to do. It's a fighting force.
Exactly. I mean, these 19, 20, 21-year-old kids, West Point kids, are the finest soldiers. Some of the finest soldiers in the world, and they're dedicated and they're brave. But they're not. I mean, can't negotiate with people whose roots are in those lands for generations and centuries, and who have a way of thinking about how they should govern themselves. And the idea that we're going to start, go over there with our copy of Jefferson's papers and start, preaching and teaching them is absurd.
No, Pat, and I had really short hair because I had my hair was just coming back from chemotherapy and stuff, so I had really, really short hair, and I was in really good shape. Like I look like I belonged in the military, but I was pretty. I look pretty, gender neutral. Let's just say that, and I was happy because a lot of these Iraqi military folks, and they probably didn't know if I was a man or woman, but I could see how they were dealing with the women soldiers, and it's just culturally they didn't like woman, like they don't get that. So it was very, very difficult. I'm getting way off topic here, but it's very difficult. All right, we got to get into this. So the big Brexit vote, of course, happened in 2016, successful, and everyone thought it's going to happen. And then, of course, 2 years later, the elites never wanted to do Brexit. Even Theresa May never really wanted to do it, never couldn't get it done. And now the EU elections, when it looks like it's going to be another rout of the traditional parties and the globalists in these elections.
Well, it's going to be very dramatic. I think Nigel Farage, in the British end of these elections, they're in all 28 countries the elections are in the European Union. I think Nigel Farage is going to come out first, and his Brexit party, which has been in existence, I think, only for about 6 or 8 weeks, I think he's going to come out number one, and he's going to get about 2 or 3 times as many votes as the Tories, who I see could come in fourth. And if that happens, and the Brexit folks do that well, and they are mainly congregated inside the Tory party, I don't know how the Tory party can go for a second referendum and go for undoing the Brexit vote of 2016. I think the Tory party is really in very dangerous straits right now. I mean, the Brexit folks, I think, will not tolerate staying in the EU or another referendum, which votes to stay in the EU after all they've done. And I think they will walk out of that Tory party, and I don't know what happens to it. You could have that wonderful creature over there in the Labour Party possibly winning an election.
Oh, God. Corbyn. What a complete disaster. Well, I mean, Boris Johnson, I think people think he's kind of crazy with his hair and stuff, but he's kind of like the British. He's kind of like Trumpian. You got the hair. You got,
He was the mayor of London. They've had some interesting folks here.
Yeah, the hair. They call him the hair of London.
But he's very well educated, and I read in a piece just the other day that he's very well spoken and very well educated, but you're right, he seems to be quite a sort of a character. But my guess is, I understand they say, after the elections, if May goes down and resigns, I think then they're going to have to replace her. And the final vote, I think, comes down to some 120,000 Tory party members, where Johnson is extremely strong. If he can win a runoff and get into that group, or get into that final two, they say he will win it. But it really is something. But this whole election, I think people should look at it closely, because Saturday and Sunday there's going to be some big headlines.
Huge.
I think Marine Le Pen could well defeat the president of France in these elections. She's got the Rally for France, I think, is the new party, of the National Rally, they call it.
Oh, you mean the xenophobe? Okay, Pat. I mean, she's a nativist, xenophobe, terrible person, you mean. Okay.
And then Matteo Salvini, I think his party's going to run number one in Italy. And he's a very powerful figure now in Europe. They're going to get this group inside the European Parliament. They're going to have about 1/4 of the seats at the end, I would guess, 170 or so.
Yeah.
And they're not going to be, it's not an enormously powerful force politically, but the message it sends is that the people, the center party, center left and center right, are really not addressing the issues that are of most concern to the peoples of Europe, and foremost among these is mass immigration.
No. I keep mentioning Sweden just because I happen to know a lot about it, and because my dear friends who are there, who are big socialists, Pat, and they're telling me every day, you've got to see what's happening in Sweden. Nobody's talking about this. Sweden is moving to a more prudent, pragmatic immigration. Even the liberal parties are moving against this migration because of the crime and everything that's happened. And you got this. So you got Sweden on the cusp here. They did that weird coalition. People forget, like in parliamentary systems, it's really hard to do what happened in the Brexit vote, because you have all these parties. So it's really hard to move when the elites all get together. So they have to form these weird coalitions.
Right. I can recall back just say about 19 years ago, at the turn of the century, there was, just several of these new right populist parties, more authoritarian in nature, outside the mainstream, and people were disparaging it. But you've got them now, as you mentioned, in Sweden. You've got them in Britain. You've got them in France. You've got them in Italy. They're very strong. You've got them in Austria, even though the Austrian thing is a bit of a mess after the weekend. But you had them in Finland. You got them in Finland. You got them in Switzerland. When these things occur, people, who, I don't care what their ideology is, liberal, socialist, whatever, you wake up and say, what is the matter here? What is happening? It's like the United States. Why were you so stunned that the American people would rise up and say, that middle America's been left behind while all this money is going abroad, and you've got all these folks who don't care about, who call middle America deplorables. And they wonder, my goodness, how did they throw us all out?
Well, they had this. How about the India vote? We get this. Narendra Modi wins massively. It's a landslide. The Nationalist Hindu Party in India, and what happened in Australia? So Scott Morrison wins the prime ministership, and then they formed some weird coalition. What happened after that? That was the big shock in Australia.
Yeah, the Conservatives did. The Conservatives carried Australia, but Modi, he's the party. The Hindu is the Hindu party, and he's very, if you will, sort of nationalistic religious, and that has enormous appeal, and to an enormous part of that country. I think it's the largest voting bloc or the largest number of largest electorate in the world when they go to the polls. But Modi seems to be doing well. But it is true worldwide that, and I will say it, even here you see what's being done to Trump on the Hill and all these subpoenas and things. I think people are coming to say, look, democracy itself isn't producing what's promised. And look
Right.
at these leaders like Xi Jinping. Look what he did for China in the last 20 years. China
With
has
our help.
emerged into one of the greatest powers in the world, or the second greatest certainly. And its future looks bright, even though they got tremendous problems. So why don't we take a look at that model rather than these models that seem to be failing in Europe and people are rejecting there?
Well, the rise of nationalism in China is whipped up by government, the government propaganda, and they.
It's very much ethno-nationalism, too, and tribalism. Mm-hmm. With the Han Chinese, you see the horrible things done to the Uyghurs.
Awful.
These are Muslim folks, who really want an East Turkestan carved out of Xinjiang province. Mm-hmm. And the Chinese got somewhere between 1 and 3 million you read about, I don't know the exact number, that are put into these camps and re-educated and have their Islamic faith, sort of drilled out of them, and their ethnic identity drilled out of them, and they're to be trained to become, re-education camps to become, just like Han Chinese and have their identity and have their origins, orientation toward Beijing, rather than who the families and the tribes from which they came. This is quite an experiment.
I mean, Americans know so little about China. I'm sorry, but it's really complicated. It's a massive, massive power now. And they rose out of poverty mostly because of the United States. I mean, the WTO and most favored nation status. I mean, we enriched them.
We bought $4 trillion more in goods from them than they bought from us. And we all threw open the door, brought them into the WTO, gave them most favored nation treatment, where all their products made in China get easy access to the vast American market. So all these good, loyal American companies say, why not move our factories over there and produce there much more cheaply with fewer regulations and no taxes and no unions thing. Produce there, they make $2 an hour or something, or $1 an hour, and then send the finished products to the United States. Profits will soar, the shareholders will be happy, and all the executives of the company can become, multimillionaires. And we did that since the early 90s. Good old Republican Party, free trade party. And now everybody bemoans the consequences of it, and they said, good Lord, we've got to stand up to China. Who built up China?
No.
I mean, who gave them all that money for all those ships in the South China Sea and those bases? I mean, who's financing the Belt and Road Initiative? It's good old Americans.
Well, I got to say, you know what else?
I was a very little kid. I'm talking about real little. When it was during World War II, and, but I was 3 years old to 7, all I could hear about cursing of the people who had sold the scrap metal to Japan that we'd gotten back at Pearl Harbor. But these guys didn't just sell scrap metal. They moved companies, plants, technology, accommodated whatever the Chinese demanded for the privilege of basing themselves there and getting those low wages and stuff, and then sending their stuff to the United States to Walmart. And the money just poured in.
Well, and now now the consequences. Now they're saying they're not going to give us rare earth materials necessary for every computer.
One of the things of economic patriotism that Hamilton and the others wanted to ensure was, we got to end our dependence on the British. We don't make anything here, they found out during the Revolutionary War. We need the French ships and the French guns and the French uniforms, and Hamilton says, we got to rely on ourselves, for habitation, for defense, for food, all of these things. We got to make ourselves economically independent of the entire world, and we did. That's why we could stay out of World War I and World War II, and we had no real crises here, and even and we could defend ourselves and feed ourselves and all the rest of it, while the British, a couple of submarines around their islands almost sank them.
Pat Buchanan, it is so great to talk to you always. Historical perspective, political perspective. As Nancy Pelosi is almost on a daily basis saying that she's praying for the president and hoping there's
which way?
praying for what to happen to him.
Let me tell you a story. Woodrow Wilson, after he had his stroke, these Republican senators who were trying to kill his League of Nations and his Versailles Treaty came down and said, we're praying for you, Mr. President. And Wilson said, which way, Senator?
Oh yeah, they wanted a certain. Oh, we'll just play this for you, Pat, just for good measure before we let you go. Let's listen to Pelosi just moments ago.
So, but the president again stormed out. I think first pound the table, walk out the door. What? Next time, have the TV cameras in there while I have my say. That didn't work for him either. And now this time, another temper tantrum. Again, I pray for the President of the United States. I wish that his family or his administration or his staff would have an intervention for the good of the country.
Oh. Your reaction there.
Did she it was a very low voice, I heard it, but did she say we got to pray that the family has an intervention for the good of the country?
Yeah.
I mean, I would like to get some clarification on that.
Yeah, exactly. It's called a coup. They're still doing a coup. This time they want the family to do it for them. I mean,
I'm just writing on this today, on what happened and what does it mean. And quite clearly, I mean, Trump is correct if he believes that this is not just oversight that they want these subpoenas, all these documents for. They clearly want to take him down. And they want to end his presidency, impeach him, and dismiss him in disgrace, and eventually, I think, lead him out of there in handcuffs when he's in the private sector. And the question is, how should the President of the United States react to folks who are doing this? Should he cooperate in any way, or should he fight him with everything he's got, all the powers he's got? And that's my view that I think he's got to do, and I think he's sort of, when you hear yesterday, I think he's come to that conclusion. That this is a war to the end, and I'm going to fight all the way.
Yeah, I think that he's doing it the right thing. I first thought, well, maybe he should just sit down with them. But frankly, I didn't like the idea of a $2 trillion infrastructure package anyway. I mean, who's paying for that?
I think McConnell agrees with you.
Yeah, I like what? $2 trillion?
That's an enormous amount of money, exactly. And where are they going to borrow it to do that?
Yeah, help the Chinese again, Pat. The Chinese will buy our debt.
To build the roads, you got to use American labor.
Yeah, exactly. Well, by the way, the Italians, this is a mistake that Salvini made. They signed this big deal with China, like a $17 billion deal with China.
They're bringing in the Chinese to do the building?
Yep. Ukraine just signed some big deal, Belt and Road. See, a lot of these countries are cash-strapped after all this globalization. They're cash-strapped. Because of all this social welfare state. They think
debt,
yeah. Now they think the Chinese are going to help them. Canada tried that. Now they're trying to wiggle out of their relationship with China because of what's happened in Canada. So they're all finding out that there's strings attached with the Chinese investment.
Well, it's not only strings. That's right. The Chinese build the ports, and you run the ports, and then when you default on your debts, they take over the ports, and the ports belong to them. It's It's a sort of quasi-imperial strategy, and it's working. But there has been, I noticed, in Southeast Asia, a reaction. I think in Malaysia and elsewhere, they say, "Look, we don't want your money because we know what comes with it. If and when we default, you're not going to have the IMF bailing us out. You guys come and take the port."
How do you think Taiwan's feeling right now, Pat? Do you think they're feeling secure?
Well, Taiwan is deeply tied to China right now. In terms of trade, China's its number one trade partner. It's very dependent on China, and one of the parties there is much more interested in independence. I think it's the old Kuomintang of Chiang, which is now much more cozied up to Beijing than the other party. But I think if Taiwan declared independence, that would be a casus belli for Beijing. I don't think Beijing would let it happen.
I love it when you say casus belli. Spur of war, right? Cause of war, yeah. Cause of war, But my daughter's just learning, her vocabulary. So we're doing the Latin and the Greek and the bellicose and what is Bella and Bella's war, sworn in Spanish. Oh my gosh, going through all that, Pat. Remember that those days in the old Catholic school days, Pat, with the Latin? It really helps you to this day.
6 years of Latin, and when we were freshmen in high school, we had it twice a day.
Oh, my God. Gonzaga. This is the Buchanan boys. When they weren't in fist fights, they were doing their Latin drills. That was good. Pat, we love you. Thank you so much for joining us. We just love having you on.
Okay, you take it easy. Bye-bye.
All right. We'll talk to you soon. And remember, thanks to all of our sponsors who supported this podcast, Genucel, Pluto TV, and Zeal. We love them all. And remember, Pat Buchanan is a national treasure. He is incredible. There are very few people left, frankly, writing who have the experience both from the Nixon administration, the Reagan administration, all the way through to today, and everything that he has written and understood way